Alright, YouTube, you remember last week when Obama came out and said, the NSA programs are not being abused. To my knowledge, there's no abuse going on in the NSA programs. And everyone, at least on the left side of the media, sort of gave him a pass, said, alright, well, it's good enough for us. Well, it turns out that he was actually lying. The program is being abused. If you look at the Washington Post, their story came out today, and the link is in the description as usual. Apparently, there was another tidbit of information given to them by Snowden. Actually, the NSA programs have been abused thousands of times over the last year. Thousands of people had had their material gone through, their online or phone material gone through, and searched through improperly and illegally. It's against even the tenets of Obama's own executive order that this was done. Now, first, years ago, when the existence of these programs was first posited, everyone said, you're just being paranoid, these programs don't even exist. Then it turned out that they did exist, and everyone said, well, don't worry, it's just to monitor foreigners or people talking on a regular basis with foreigners. You're just being paranoid, it's not being used for anyone else. Then it came out that that was a lie. It came out that actually they were tracking everyone. Then they're like, oh, it's just metadata. All we're going through is people's phone metadata, because we need to do that in order to find out who's talking to people on a regular basis overseas that might not be such good characters. You're just being paranoid. And it turned out that wasn't true. Then they said, oh, well, yeah, they're collecting more than just metadata, but they've got to have, they've got to have a warrant, and there's no abuse going on. Nothing's wrong is going on here. They're just sort of collecting this data. Don't worry, it's not going to be abused. If you're not doing anything wrong, you don't have to worry. Nobody's going to go through anything that you're doing. And now it's turned out that that's a lie. And by the way, they use this in investigations that don't even involve terrorism, which is the stated mission goal. That came out about a week ago, that actually they were using it for drug-related crimes as well. Every single time that the apologists for this administration have opened their mouths to say that anyone questioning the NSA is being paranoid, they've turned out to be wrong. Now you can see the pattern here. 5 different times they have been wrong. Each time I keep hearing these people say, well, if you were right, if the libertarians or the T-billies or whatever were right, then I'd be opposed to these programs too, because then it would be abusive, but it's not happening. If they were being used for more than metadata, it would be tyrannical, but certainly the government's not doing that, and then every time they have to backtrack and say, well, it's not really a problem because, and they keep giving these lame-ass reasons why it's still not a problem. What do you have next? Do you have to find out that, by the way, there are hidden cameras in every home and business, and there are, mechanical mosquitoes going around injecting people with RFID tags or something? Is that tyranny, or would they make up some excuse for that too? And the thing is this, the same left-wing individuals, I've pointed it out, I don't like the left or the right wing, and the Republicans have been largely complicit in these programs. Back when Bush was president, he did similar things. You've got to remember, it wasn't that long ago that Bush was the president, and he was authoritarian too, and the left wing hated it, and they stood up against it, and they protested, and they said no more war, no more domestic surveillance, we're tired of warrantless wiretaps, we're tired of people not getting proper trials and going to Gitmo, and they were all up in arms about it. Now that there's a Democratic president, the Republicans are, well, not even the Republicans, the Republican Party doesn't care either. You see a handful of Tea Partiers protesting, and the liberals and most of the conservatives don't care. They've got their heads in the sand, and Congress hasn't been helpful. There was a coalition to try to stem the tide of this NSA nonsense through the Amash Amendment and the Holt Amendment. The Amash Amendment failed, narrowly, but it failed, showing you the level of corruption also in the Congress. But these same people, they constantly tell the libertarians, well, if it went one step further, it would be wrong, it would be illegal, immoral, unconstitutional, and tyrannical. Each time they put that line in the sand, they're forced to cross it and then draw another line. They've done that almost half a dozen times now. At what point do you say, because do you honestly think Snowden's done leaking information? Everyone is like, well, he's gone quiet now, he's not going to leak anything else. Well, I guess it's not that bad because the NSA, they're only tracking metadata. Each time they kind of get comfy, a week later or something, Snowden comes out with a new leak saying, by the way, it's worse than you thought. And people just put their heads in the sand. Now, thankfully, there is a gem of happiness here. Public opinion has shifted for the first time in many years. From the time of 9/11 until very recently, most Americans polled said they'd be willing to give up some of their liberty for extra security to be more safe. It's reversed now. For the first time in about 10 years, it's the opposite. And more than half of people are not willing to give up liberty for security, which our founders thought that we should have both. That our security never required giving up liberty. Because the founders were intelligent enough to know you're not actually safe when the government begins to use such programs. These things are getting increasingly problematic. And you see a lot of, it's on front page news all over the world right now that this is happening. This new leak is the most concerning yet. It's all over the place. Washington Post, Fox, CNN, MSNBC, Russia Today, Al Jazeera, all of these sites are covering it because guess what? This goes beyond just our country. First, we knew it went beyond because they said explicitly they were targeting primarily individuals in this country who had ties to people outside of the country who were less than stellar. You're talking to Ibn al-Muhammad II and talking in some weird language that isn't recognized by our machine system, and you're actually talking backwards about your plans to blow up the Eiffel Tower or something. Nobody ever cared if they monitored known terrorists. Nobody cares. It's not an infringement of liberty to go after people who are literally trying to blow things up and attack people. You can make the argument that they're really more freedom fighters than terrorists if you assume that our wars are wars of aggression. That's just a semantic issue. Going into it, if you presume these people are terrorists, I personally view them as terrorists myself. I think it's a loaded term. I think it's a bit overused. I think using it for people in this country that aren't related to jihad is a little bit nonsensical, and I think if you look at the FSA, you'll find our own government's funding what we call terrorists over in Syria. But let's let that issue go and just focus on the NSA for a while. The NSA, let me get into the icing on the cake. Obama saying the program's not being abused about a week ago. And it turns out that once again he's wrong. That in itself isn't a big issue. Presidents are wrong quite a bit. Let's look at the ramifications, though. You have to assume Obama has been getting daily briefs on the NSA, on its activities, on what it's used for specifically, on cases where it's worked, on cases where it hasn't worked, key cases, the functions of these servers, where they're building new locations. We just hired X number of agents. He's got to be given briefs on this material. For him to come out and say, no, it's not being abused, knowing full well that it had to be, I would assume, because now we know it has been and that there are documents revealing that fact, he's either A, lying to us, which most people are not very surprised at. They would assume that was the case. I'll go one further. I will say he's not lying. I will say he is either completely inept, doesn't pay attention, and doesn't care what's going on with the NSA because he's in his second term. He doesn't give a shit. He doesn't care anymore. You look at his attitude and you have to say it seems increasingly like he's either bored or disconnected and does not care. Or number two, and here's the really interesting possibility, people are withholding the information from him and he doesn't know what's going on, not through any fault of his own, but because other people are hiding it from him. There's been chatter online. Now, this could be total tinfoil hat nonsense or it could be true. about people in the CIA and their connections to Hastings that don't really like Obama and are sort of working towards other ends. It's possible. There have been splinter groups before that have done things like that. There was one case involving George Prescott Bush, which is George H.W.'s father, George W.'s granddaddy, trying to take him and a bunch of other political leaders and corporate figures trying to take over the government of the United States in a coup under FDR to make it a fascist state. You can look this up, George Prescott Bush hostile takeover, and you'll find this is a very real thing. It was an actual conspiracy, which made sense since he was selling fuel oil to the Nazis and at the same time supplying, I believe, the RAF, but nobody learns that in history class. Anyway, though, you don't have to look into this and say a bunch of conspiracy theories to know that something dishonest is going on. When George W. Bush came out, before we went into Iraq, and said, they have weapons of mass destruction, they helped do 9/11, they did this, they did that, Saddam's axis of evil, terror, terror, terror. There were a handful of people who knew that it was a lie. They knew it was a lie because the facts didn't add up. For instance, Saddam Hussein was not an Islamist. Not the type of Islamist that does jihad and things like Al-Qaeda does. Actually, he had brutally suppressed Al-Qaeda and other Islamist groups because he himself was not what you would call a traditional Muslim. He was a Ba'athist. It's a different sect of Islam. It's a different sectarian ethnic group that despises the kind of Muslims that do jihad. So he put them down brutally. He used to gas them. He attacked the Kurds for the same reason, because he was worried that they were going to take over and turn it into an Islamic state. So, and we knew there were no WMDs, and it came out years later, oh, by the way, we found a little bit of mustard gas. We think it's from the 80s because it's really not useful anymore. It's not really toxic anymore. It's just sort of residue at this point. And we found, a few vials of VX nerve agent. He may or may not have produced a few batches of it. We found some mobile compounds, but lo and behold, where's this 1,000 gallons of botulinum toxin and all the anthrax spores and pre-nuclear materials he supposedly had? Supposedly he had a massive stockpile of chemical and bioweapons. He never did. And they knew he didn't have them. They had to have known because they had agents in there. The CIA was in Iraq, like it's in every country on Earth. In a way, you can't blame the CIA. They've got to do these things because they're ordered to. But you look at the situation. We were lied to about Iraq. We went in. We crushed a bunch of cities. We lost thousands of our troops. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died. And there are still terrorists in Iraq, more than there were before when Saddam was in charge and he used to kill what we call terrorists. And we're doing the same thing now in Syria that we did with Afghanistan. We armed the clerics. We armed what became Al-Qaeda to fight the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s under Reagan's watch. Reagan referred to these individuals as freedom fighters. What we now call terrorists were originally labeled freedom fighters because they fought our enemy, thus proving that the term terrorist is entirely useless, because we used to call these people good friends of ours and give them money and cash and weapons and training and all this stuff. And the NSA nonsense has been going on for a long time. They've been wiretapping people for decades. They've been spying on email for decades. You think anyone who thinks this is a recent event is crazy. The difference is, until 9/11, number one, there was no state of emergency in effect. There has been a state of emergency perpetually in effect since 9/11. Bush declared it and extended it. Obama's extended it twice as well. And that essentially, it boils down to this. It sort of nullifies part of the Constitution. It doesn't make it go away, but it makes it less effective. So number one, we need to end the state of emergency, because until that's ended, a lot of these programs are unconstitutional. The thing is, because we're under that state of emergency, it isn't unconstitutional, kind of, technically speaking. It's a little bit of a strange legal gray area in regards to the Constitution because it's a state of emergency. That's how martial law can be declared under such a situation. When you saw the soldiers and the National Guard and so forth going door to door in Boston to catch Tsarnaev, that was unconstitutional. It's unreasonable search and seizure. They were unreasonably searching property without any specific warrant and without any specific suspicion that there was something going on in any of those residences. And of course, he was found in a boat. He wasn't found in anyone's house. The thing is, because of that state of emergency, that's nullified. Because of the state of emergency, the federal state of emergency, and then I believe one was declared by the state of Massachusetts at the time, it no longer applies to that specific situation. What we need to do is pressure Congress to get some fucking balls, and that doesn't involve just Republicans or just Democrats, it involves them all, because they all were complicit. There were a very small number of people in our Congress who voted against the Patriot Act extension, who voted against the NSA programs, who actually seem to give a damn. There are an increasing number of them, but actually seem to give a damn that these programs exist and are starting to question why. What's the justification for collecting everyone's info? You have to assume that these warrants, these blanket warrants, consider every citizen in the United States a legitimate suspect of terrorism. That's the problem. And then you can go into the Hastings death and you can say, well, was he assassinated by the CIA for going after Brennan? Was he assassinated by Obama for going after Brennan? Who knows? It's weird times indeed, but it's one thing that is good. Well, two things. One, public opinion's changing. People no longer feel like giving up their liberty. Libertarianism is on a steep incline right now, which is good. You can almost say that tyranny is a good thing from time to time, or at least a little bit of authoritarianism, because it shows people how necessary it is to preserve their freedom, what freedom they have left, in the Western world. A little bit more than if you're in North Korea, not necessarily as much freedom as you'd have in Switzerland. And number two, these leaks keep coming. And that's good. Because Obama, when he was running for office, said, well, leaks should be, whistleblowers should be encouraged. They're doing a patriotic duty. They're helping people know what's going on in government. We need more open government. We need more clarity in our government. Well, if that's true and that's honestly what he believes, then Snowden should just keep up what he's doing, because obviously Obama couldn't have changed his mind and decided once he was in power that all of a sudden it was a problem. You see, candidate Obama had no problem with whistleblowers because there were a few under Bush, and I'm sure he sat back and laughed because everyone knew Bush was pushing an authoritarian agenda. Everyone knew that Bush was, number one, ineffective and kind of a little bit touched in the head. Number two, he was authoritarian and or controlled by corporate interests. Everyone knew that about Bush. Nobody had it, even most of the Republicans knew that he had too many corporate ties to not be in somebody's pocket at one time or another. With Obama, it was different because he came off as this inexperienced, young, youthful, vigorous outsider, community organizer. So there are a lot of people who still trust him even though it's clear that he's lying. And these people have been so brainwashed that they assume that anyone criticizing Obama is, number one, either they're number one, a racist, which most of them are not, or number two, they're some real hardliner and they just have a problem. There are a lot of people who, when I'm arguing on forums or whatever, they'll say, well, you must be one of those rural redneck tea partiers, you eat an all-meat diet, or you have a mullet, you have 20 children and you go to a Mormon church or something. And that sort of stereotype, ironically, makes them the ones that seem more bigoted than anybody who's criticizing Obama. I don't criticize him because he's black. I don't care about the color of his skin. I criticized Bush heavily. And people who remember my channel from 2007, 2008, remember, I was very critical of Bush. I hated Bush. Bush was just as bad as Obama. I criticized Bush. If I had been on YouTube back during the early days of Bush, I would have criticized him even more and had a great time doing it because he screwed up. He fucked up the country. And Obama seems to be doing his best, either through corruption or ineptitude, we can't tell which, to do the same thing. So go to that article that's linked. It's interesting. Even if you don't really like politics, you should care because you might not live in the United States, but guess what? PRISM and the NSA and all these things are intertwined with like 80 other countries. You're probably being monitored by your country's surveillance grid too. You should really learn about ours because it's the model from which a lot of these programs are taken. And the Brits, for all of you out there in the UK, guess what? Your program's even more pervasive than ours. Your program is larger and collects more data than ours does. You not only collect all data from Britain, you also comb through Germany's data, and Germany is also pervasive. France and Germany and the Netherlands and Denmark. I think British companies are monitoring India. It's all interconnected. It's a worldwide network. It's really pervasive and really concerning for everyone who just wants to be left the fuck alone. We don't want Uncle Sam in our bathroom watching us beat off or piss in the toilet. We don't need it. And we don't want Uncle Sam really going through our racy text messages, or Uncle Sam or Uncle Britain or Uncle Der Spiegel or any of these other groups going through anything, because they don't need to. Because no real judge issued any warrant to go through our shit. It has nothing to do with we've got something to hide, or we're terrorists, or we hate Uncle Sam and we're going to blow everything up. It has nothing to do with being some radical that goes out in the woods in a cabin like Ted Kaczynski and makes pipe bombs. It has nothing to do with it. Those people are few and far between. The majority of people that oppose these programs simply enjoy privacy. Just as you wouldn't want some stalker looking through your garbage at night, you don't want Uncle Sam doing the same thing. It just boils down to that. It makes people physically uncomfortable. Peace out.